I'm Greg Gottlieb. I'm the director of the Feinstein International Center at Tufts University School of Nutrition, and I'll be the chair of today's webinar. We actually have more than 400 people registered for this webinar and are really thrilled that there's so much interest. This is a Feinstein International Center record for registration, so thank you all for joining us. Today, more than ever, we need good information to anticipate, prevent, mitigate, and respond to famines and other humanitarian emergencies. We have learned a lot over the past couple of decades about collecting, analyzing, and acting on good information. As the chief of party of the Famine Early Warning System in the 1990s, I saw firsthand the challenges of collecting and analyzing information. But we've come a long ways from those days. Later in USAID, I had to rely on that information for making critical decisions about policies, programs, and resource allocation. But we know from hard experience that information is power, and power is about politics. And nowhere is humanitarian information more subject to politics than in the analysis and declaration of famine. We didn't need a research project to tell us famine analysis can be politicized, but we did need it to help us understand how and especially what to do about it. Therefore, for the past several years, a team from the Feinstein International Center at Tufts and the Center for Humanitarian Change in Nairobi have been looking into this question. For those who don't know about these centers, the Feinstein International Center is a research and teaching center at Tufts University. The center promotes the use of evidence and learning in operational and policy responses to protect and strengthen the lives and livelihoods and dignity of people affected by or at risk of humanitarian crises. And the Center for Humanitarian Change works with practitioners and action research partners using an experiential approach to transform the way aid is organized and managed in the fragile areas of East Africa. For those of you who haven't seen the full report, the case study reports or the policy briefing papers that have accompanied each, they are on the websites of both the Feinstein International Center and the Center for Humanitarian Change. We will put the link to the study in the chat during the webinar. We will also share it by email to everyone who registered early next week. A few housekeeping items before we begin. First, apologies to those of you who had a hard time getting the login information. We had a bit of technical difficulty, but by number of people logged in, it appears that was solved yesterday. There are many people who made this webinar possible, and before we start, we must thank all our donors, DFID and their East Africa Research Fund, the Office of Swiss Cooperation and Development, ECHO through a subgrant from Action Against Hunger, USAID's Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance, and MQ-SUN Plus. We would also like to thank the 350 key informants the study team interviewed for the 6-country case studies. For the most part, these people were busy professionals, decision makers, local leaders, and humanitarian agency officials. We thank them for taking time to speak to our team. Several key individuals deserve to be thanked for their support and contributions to, and sometimes exasperated forbearance with, this study. We can't name them all, but they know who they are. This webinar is scheduled for 1.5 hours, and we promise to end on time. Here's how the webinar will go. Dan Maxwell and study team to introduce the study, its findings and recommendations. 2 external independent analysts who have peer-reviewed the study will offer their own take on the findings. I'll introduce them when we get to that portion. Then we'll have a general discussion with a Q&A for the remaining time. We're looking forward to a lively and engaging discussion and hope that you will participate to share your experiences and ask questions. We'll have about 30 minutes at the end for Q&A. I encourage you to use the chat function to participate and ask questions as they come to mind. For those of you not familiar with WebEx, on the bottom of your screen, you should see several icons. Click the gray one with the chat icon. That will open the chat box on the right side of your screen. You can send questions at any point, and when we get to the Q&A portion, we will do our best to answer all your questions. Let me introduce the study team and then turn it over to Dan. Dan Maxwell is the Henry J. Lear Professor in Food Security and Research Director at the Feinstein International Center. He works on famine, food security and resilience, and livelihood systems under stress. For the past 6 years, he has served on the Famine Review Committee for Integrated Phase Classification Analysis, a committee that is mobilized whenever a possible famine declaration is a possible result of an analysis. He co-led the study we are discussing today. Jian Kim is the Senior Resilience Researcher at Mercy Corps and a visiting fellow at the Feinstein International Center. She works closely with practitioners, research partners, and policy colleagues to design and implement actionable resilience research in fragile contexts. Her recent research focuses on social connectedness, food security and resilience, and migration issues. Jian led on the scoping study in 2017 and supported the case studies in South Sudan, Nigeria, and Somalia. Lindsay Spainhour-Baker has worked on health and nutrition programs for various humanitarian organizations in East Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia over the past 16 years. Lindsay led major elements of the Yemen study and supported the case studies on Kenya and Ethiopia as a research associate for the Center for Humanitarian Change. And finally, Peter Haley is a director of the Center for Humanitarian Change based in Nairobi and a visiting fellow at Feinstein Center. Currently, his work is focused on information systems in fragile areas, the use of an adaptive learning approach to promote a more contextually relevant approach to aid, health, and nutrition systems, resilience, and supporting the nutrition and public health, the coronavirus in East Africa. He also serves on the Famine Relief Committee for Integrated Phase Classification Analysis. Peter co-led the study we're discussing today. Dan, over to you to frame the study.
Great. Thank you, Greg, and welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Over the past decade, we've made a lot of progress as a community of practice in improving our ability to assess, analyze, and classify famines and other humanitarian disasters. The level of rigor and reliability and the validity of humanitarian information has improved significantly. But these analyses and the classifications that they result in really do matter. Declarations of famine or the projections of the risk of famine have been instrumental in mobilizing prevention and response. In Somalia, in 2011, for example, a declaration of famine doubled the donor support for response literally overnight. As Greg can no doubt testify, the risk of famine raised by FuseNet and others in 2017 helped him raise an extra $1 billion for famine prevention and response from a U.S. Congress that was not exactly known to be loose with its purse strings. Some of that money undoubtedly helped to avert a repeat of 2011 in Somalia and helped in Yemen and other similar cases. But precisely because the word famine has the power to mobilize attention like this, it is also highly politicized. Numerous parties have an interest in shaping or influencing or sometimes blocking or suppressing information about famine and other extreme emergencies. To the affected state, the word famine implies a failure of governance. It may imply a violation of international humanitarian law, and it certainly offers opposition politicians or even armed groups major fodder with which to undermine the government of the day. On the other hand, to donors and humanitarian agencies, it certainly implies a failure of response, and it very likely implies a failure to adequately heed early warning information. For local communities, it can be a failure to adequately look out for their own vulnerable members. Our observation on the Famine Review Committee over the past 6 years is that the closer to famine an analysis comes, the more fraught with politics it can become. Over the past 3 years, we have found evidence of attempts to undermine data collection and analysis, to quash reports, to stop analysis procedures, or to silence analysts. This doesn't happen every time that famine analysis occurs, but it happens often enough for us to be worried about it. Across nearly all contemporary cases of famine or famine risk, the common causal factor is violent conflict. While other factors are also implicated, the common denominator of conflict makes the analysis of these crises even more politically fraught. First, security and access constraints often make data collection more difficult, if not impossible, and can be invoked if authorities simply don't want data to be collected. But also, humanitarian status can be invoked as a kind of a proxy for the state of the conflict itself, putting pressure on analysts to reflect this status in a light that is conducive to powerful conflict actors. And many other factors contribute to political influences. In short, to paraphrase the words of a colleague, while we like to think about information and analysis as informing evidence-based policymaking, what we often see in reality is something more like policy-based evidence-making. For the past 3 years, this team has been studying the ways that various actors attempt to influence the analysis of famine and other extreme emergencies. Although for Peter and me, this concern grew out of our work on the Famine Review Committee, the study was independent of that or any other body, undertaken only by the Feinstein Center and the Center for Humanitarian Change. The study considered 6 different country cases, 5 of which have either had famines or have been closely watched for the risk of famine over the past several years. Table 1 shows these countries in the order that we undertook the study. Over the course of those 3 years, as Greg mentioned, we've conducted nearly 350 interviews with information specialists, with analysis teams, government officials, aid agency and donor representatives, and local leaders, and we've also reviewed a mountain of evidence, of documentary evidence. Before we delve into the study itself, though, I'd like to clarify a couple of things that may have crossed your mind as you looked at the report or the policy briefing that accompanied this presentation. First, because of the emphasis on famine, it was inevitable that a good deal of this study was going to be focused on the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification System, or IPC, and the very similar system in West Africa, the Cadre Harmonisé. We've had a lot of back and forth over the course of this study with IPC teams, both globally and nationally. But this study also considered a lot of other information and analysis systems, some of them local or national systems, some other global systems. We have looked at early warning systems, at real-time monitoring systems, and other approaches to assessment besides IPC. But I want to be clear that this study was not commissioned by IPC, and it certainly was not intended to be an evaluation of IPC. Margie Buchanan-Smith, who is with us today, led a team that did a comprehensive evaluation of the IPC last year, and I certainly invite you to read it. But this was a specific study on the way in which information systems and analysis procedures are affected or undermined by political influences. And we're highlighting examples of the kinds of influences that we found, but that's not to imply that they happen all the time. Second, famine and humanitarian emergencies, particularly conflict-related ones, are political events. There's no question about it. It's not news to anybody that political interests will try to pressure analysts to paint a picture that is flattering to them. And we know it's unrealistic to think that analyses can operate completely independently of political interests. So to us, the challenge was to find the means to manage the politics and minimize its influence. That was the ultimate goal of the study. Third, this study's been going on for more than 3 years, and some of the early findings or recommendations have already been acted on. Nevertheless, we describe them here not to deny that efforts at improvement have already been undertaken, but because this study only covered 6 countries, and some of these issues doubtlessly arise elsewhere as well. Some people responded to the synthesis report by asking if we couldn't be a little more specific in our recommendations. We can, of course, but a lot of the ways these recommendations would be operationalized are very context specific. So the next and actually final step of this research is to engage in smaller meetings with specific teams or groups of stakeholders to discuss the implementation of these recommendations in their context. If we haven't already contacted your team about this, but you'd like to have a conversation, please let us know. We would, of course, like to do this in person, but like everything else these days, this would imply yet another tedious Zoom meeting. And finally, of course, speaking of Zoom meetings, this study started long before the current pandemic, but many of the ways in which political actors attempt to influence data collection and analysis of famine have also been blatantly manifest in the information and analysis put out about the pandemic. Over the past couple of months, we've seen the numbers of the afflicted, of the dead, of available testings, etc., being reported, spun, denied, and politicized in one way or another in all but a handful of the countries that have been significantly affected. So while the study we're presenting today refers specifically to famine, we think the findings are of interest and hopefully application much more broadly. This presentation will follow the objectives and research questions of the study itself. And those objectives were shown here on this slide, and they were as follows. First, to identify key constraints to the completeness, independence, rigor, and reliability of data collection, with some sub-questions to go along with that. Second, to assess the process of analysis to understand any pressures of influence on that process, again with some sub-questions. Third, to document good practice in managing these influences. And finally, to engage with policymakers, humanitarian leaders, and donors on recommendations. Slide 7 shows the major outputs of the study, including the initial data scoping study that MQ-Sun funded for us, the 6 country case studies, and the synthesis report that we're speaking to today. Each of these major reports also comes with an attendant short policy brief. We've noted a number of the themes that occur commonly across most or all of these cases, but we can really only highlight a few of them here today. You'll see in our presentation a couple of tables that list about a dozen themes related to data collection or analysis processes, which then show the case studies in which that issue arose. There are actually 4 such tables in the report, and we only look at 2 of them briefly here today, and indeed only a handful of the issues that arise in those tables. So I strongly urge you to take a look at the synthesis report. And as I noted, we hope to engage with many of you in a more context-specific application of the recommendations. Thanks once again for joining us today, and back to you, Greg.
Thanks, Dan. Much appreciated. I think one of the things that strikes me about what you said was this notion of reliability, particularly from where I sat when I was at USAID, trying to understand how reliable the data was with which we were trying to make decisions on what programs to fund and how much money to ask for. So I think for many of you I know that are with large organizations, I think that may be one area that's of real interest to you. Let me turn to Gian now, who's going to discuss the challenges with data and data collection that we noted in our study. Gian, over to you.
Thanks, Greg. Our case studies found that in famine or near famine emergencies, numerous factors, some blatant and others a little bit more subtle, put pressures on the independent assessments and information collection process. This is especially true in contexts affected by conflict. These efforts to influence assessments and data collection more broadly can take multiple forms, ranging from direct interference, limiting or prohibiting access, creating real or imagined security obstacles, bureaucratic hindrances, to interfering with field teams in extreme cases, to name just a few examples. They occur across geographic contexts, types of crises, and all sectors of humanitarian information, collection, and analysis. And they also come from several sources: governments who do not want the depth of a crisis to be exposed, donors who want to see results given their investment in the humanitarian response, or agencies who want the analysis to showcase the positive impact of their programming. In order to manage and mitigate these influences, there first needs to be an understanding of where these come from and what motivations underlie these efforts. Here's one of those tables Dan was alluding to. Across the 6 case studies, several issues relating to data and data collection practices emerged. While many of these constraints to good information collection are technical in nature with technical remedies, many remain extremely political. These technical issues may create ambiguity and opportunity for political interference, and in other instances, the efforts to address these technical issues may be subject to political influences. And as Dan noted, given our limited time together, I will touch upon just a few issues today and encourage you to visit the case studies or the synthesis report for additional details. First major issue is that of missing data, and 3 categories were most frequently missing in analyses. Of the 3, mortality data are the most politically charged kind of information which were frequently missing in our case studies. And in many cases, technical analysts attributed the absence of mortality data to their not wanting to or fearing to tread in politically sensitive areas. In South Sudan, the gap in mortality information was so obvious at one point that a mortality study was independently conducted without IPC teams' participation, nor with government's knowledge. And that study showed mortality levels which were well above famine thresholds, although many of the deaths were attributed to the conflict and not necessarily to malnutrition or disease. While this example is one of the more blatant cases of political risks run by independent analysts to collect missing mortality information, mortality data were frequently missing in other analyses. And as many of you on this webinar will know, in famine analyses, the lack of mortality data makes any judgment of famine impossible. Direct statements of the existence or threat of famine cannot be made without mortality data. Population information is also critical for estimating the number of people who require assistance. At the end of the analysis processes, the population in need number is what governments, donor, and humanitarian agencies look out for. In extreme emergencies, population information is subject to significant doubt, and in recent census data are also hard to come by. In absence of reliable population figures, it is difficult in turn to turn assessment results into practical plans. And while there are many working to resolve this issue, the lack of recent or reliable baseline population information remains a critical gap in the analyses. Relatedly, in conflict, which affected all of our case studies except for Kenya, populations are on the move, and their displacement is likely to significantly affect population figures. In some places like Somalia, there's relatively good displacement figures. In other places like Ethiopia, assessment of displacement population is highly politically contentious. Populations that are trapped or in besieged areas are even less understood and can be politically controversial for these analyses. Lastly, nutrition data were sometimes missed from analyses, as some existing information did not meet the relatively high standards set for nutrition data, and in other instances, they were simply too out of date. In addition to these, information on other key related sectors such as health or WASH are often altogether missing or not included in assessment plans in the first place. Across our case studies and between sectors, there's a lot of variability in terms of data quality. When there are nutrition data, they are standardized by SMART methodologies, which outline clear data quality requirements, standards for enumerator training, and field checks. Food security data, on the other hand, are a little bit more mixed in terms of quality. Standards for quantitative sampling for the data are clear, but standards for enumerator training and field checks are often not met in the field. In some cases, data quality is further limited by the technical capacity of the field teams. As team members must be recruited locally on a temporary basis, the pool of talent may be limited. And these challenges are further compounded by short training times and pressures of deadlines, often resulting in lower quality training and in turn, lower quality data. Humanitarian information systems are dominated by quantitative data and quantitative analyses. However, in most extreme cases, this data may not be available, compromised by a limited sample size, or collected in non-random way that severely limits generalization. In near famine or extreme emergencies, assessment teams are also fighting against time or unable to access areas due to insecurity. However, to date, very little capacity or guidance exists for the collection and analysis of qualitative information in such circumstances. In turn, the use of qualitative information analyses are highly variable and especially vulnerable to political manipulation. Qualitative information is sometimes discarded as hearsay and other times used strategically to shift analytical discussions for political reasons. The lack of a clear guidance on the qualitative data means that political influences rather than evidence becomes the basis for analytical outcomes. And finally, there are key issues of lack of common practice around data sharing. Across the board, agencies are reluctant to share data. For food security data, there's not a standard protocol for data sharing. And in South Sudan, Nigeria, and Yemen, the lack of access to food security data sets in real time led to major disagreement between parties participating in the analysis process over how outcomes like food security should be interpreted. For nutrition information and systems, on the other hand, there's usually a standard protocol for sharing data sets. However, this is after data have been vetted, the reports have been written up, though there are exceptions to this case. And there are several reasons why agencies may be reluctant to share data in real time. First, whoever controls the data controls the narrative. This is obviously to the advantage of the data collecting agency. In some cases, the level of competition among information systems can be intense, and maintaining control of data provides a competitive edge. Some respondents also noted that there's a fear of data being interpreted differently, resulting in contradictory findings and recommendations. The agency collecting the data or the government authorizing the data collection want to stick with the story that they want to tell. Related to this is a fear of critique on methodological rigor. Given the extremely challenging circumstances under which data were collected, agencies may be nervous about sharing their less than perfect data and opening themselves up for scrutiny. As I highlighted earlier, before I began my presentation, many of these data and data collection issues are technical in nature, and most can be remedied with technical solutions. However, addressing these technical issues and the analytical ambiguities and gaps they create are frequently subject to political influences. Lindsay will speak to these issues further. Back to you, Greg.
Thank you, Gian. The thing that strikes me in what you said is that, when you talk about conflict, it's hard enough in many of these circumstances to collect data. So the politics really just kind of put pressure on an already fraught information gathering system. And then I think it just gets compounded, as you note, when the data sharing, when the lack of data sharing inhibits more rapid collection of information. So I think from perspective of decision makers, it just, it's a further delay and confusion of what they have to deal with. But so let me do this. Let me now turn to Lindsay to talk about the challenges related to the analysis of data that Gian just talked about. Lindsay, over to you.
Thank you, Greg. One of the research questions guiding this study was to assess the process of analysis, to understand any pressures or influences on it. Numerous factors influence how the analysis is conducted and the outcomes or outputs of that analysis. The table you see here, Table 3, provides a summary overview across all 6 case studies, and it categorizes the influences on the analysis. Some of these are overt, some subtle, and you can note that there are themes similar across multiple, if not all, of the countries. We can by no means cover the complete list, therefore we'll highlight 6 challenges reported from respondents. Perhaps one of the most important aspects of the analysis system studied is that it should be a technical consensus. The best analysts in the country pulling together the best data, working together to produce their best analysis of a complex situation that threatens people's right to basic needs. In this technical consensus process, where in theory, all parties are engaged in the analysis and response, a limitation reported by respondents in all 6 case studies is that the analysis process at times was dominated by a few large actors. This includes national governments and some of the larger agencies. These are powerful actors who overpower other perspectives, sometimes despite the evidence. In other words, dubbed the loudest voice in the room. This may be based on the political power of the agency represented, and that was the case reported from South Sudan, Nigeria, Somalia, and Yemen, or on the reputation or experience of an individual. And there are examples of this in all cases. So ensuring a wide base of participation where all involved have a voice in the process can actually counterbalance that loudest voice in the room. But the greater the participation, the more difficult the coordination. As well, the broader the inclusion of a wide array of sources, the greater the constraints are on ensuring data quality and reliability. The best leaders of these processes should be technical experts with the ability to manage political processes, encourage that widespread participation, and ensure that the whole process remains evidence-based and independent. This combination of technical and diplomatic skills needed to lead these processes was reported as a constraint, specifically in South Sudan, Nigeria, Yemen, and Ethiopia. The trade-offs are inevitable, and the nature of these trade-offs may also determine the extent to which information and analysis can be influenced. As a result, data collection, analysis, and reporting is in some cases concentrated in the hands of a relatively small group of analysts, who for the most part work for a relatively limited number of agencies. An analytical concern regarding famine analysis in particular is the risk of an inaccurate classification. Systems have been built with strong protections against a false positive determination, And to clarify, that's the risk of an analysis determining that there's a famine when there actually isn't one. In the South Sudan, Yemen, and Nigeria case studies, the information requirements for the determination of a famine and the rigor required of that data set a very high bar for any actual declaration. The consequences of missing or very limited data, as mentioned previously by Gian, mean that when it comes time to determine a famine, it's often not possible to make firm statements. And sometimes this can't be helped. But for instance, if field teams are not allowed to collect reliable mortality data in a specific location, it's a certain means of preventing the determination of a famine. It's important to note, though, that there are many fewer protections against a false negative determination. And to clarify, that's the risk of failing to determine that there's a famine when there actually is one. The consequences of that false negative is worse in humanitarian terms, the potential loss of life, livelihoods, and dignity. The next point is the political interference that was frequently documented was coming from national governments, but it also came from humanitarian agencies or from donors. Overt government interference included reports being suppressed, analyses being stopped, and individuals being threatened with deportation or removed from their jobs. The interference also included demands for changes in reports or alterations to the number of people in need. Given the politically fraught implications of famine, technically the IPC Phase 5, instances of analytical compromise or even self-censorship are not uncommon. In the case studies of South Sudan, Nigeria, Yemen, and Ethiopia, a compromise consensus is often to put a large part of the population into Phase 3 and Phase 4, but none in Phase 5. This keeps famine out of the conclusions by increasing numbers in need in the less severe, but nevertheless still serious categories. This politically negotiated outcome to the analysis that is just right means that all parties can live with it, even if it does not agree with the evidence and does not serve the affected population. This just right negotiated outcome can limit the risk of angering a host government, which doesn't like to hear the word famine, while still allowing humanitarian agencies to continue the response, protect budgets and their pipelines while not getting in political hot water with the government. It also allows agencies to manage expectation and reputations in regard to their donors. All of this compromises the independence and impartiality of the process. One of the key outputs of these analyses is the number of people in need of emergency food assistance. These numbers are highly subject to political pressures, with analysis teams pressured to both increase and decrease the numbers, depending on the circumstances. Sometimes these numbers are changed by administrators after analyses are finished. The numbers, of course, determine the humanitarian needs overviews, the H&Os, and other donor requirements in situations where other sources of information are scarce. This number has a major influence on resource allocation, the ability of agencies to intervene, and governments' claim of legitimately protecting their people. The people in need number is also sometimes used as a bit of a scorecard, with declining numbers reflecting well on the investment of the humanitarian response plan just completed. These numbers are subject to so much meddling in some of the contexts that donors have begun trying to keep their own separate numbers and try to gather information independently. Part of the issue with the population in need figure is that by the time the numbers come out, they're already a bit out of date. It takes a while to pull together and analyze all the numbers. And this means that people pay more attention to the projected numbers, the population in need in the near future, rather than the current status numbers. But of course, the projections are subject to lots of assumptions about what's going to happen, and those assumptions can easily be changed to make a different number sensible, be it higher or lower. Not all users understand the difference between the hard numbers of current assessed need and the more probabilistic nature of the numbers in the projections. The way that these numbers get changed undermines trust in the whole system, resulting in a situation like donors keeping separate numbers. The last point is that although famine and extreme emergencies do have multiple causes, conflict is the common thread among causes of contemporary famine. To reiterate what Gian spoke to before, conflict was a significant cause of food security crises in all but one of the countries studied, and that was Kenya. In all the other countries, conflict was the major causal factor, and in at least 3 cases, it was the main cause of famine or crisis. The analysis of conflict is frequently either incomplete or relegated to a brief mention as a contributing factor. However, considering that conflict information or analysis is also the most highly politicized, it's the most problematic to include. And this is particularly the case when the government is party to a conflict that's the cause of the crisis, but also in situations in which the conflict is not the major driver, the parties in an analysis may be reluctant to try to include it. There are so many more issues that might arise in the Q&A, but for now I'd like to pass it back to Greg. Thank you.
Good, thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, some very interesting points there. I mean, again, I can say, having come from the U.S. government, that we tended to have a pretty loud voice on things. So, which makes for very interesting commentary on your next point, which is that, yes, I think major donors can push oftentimes for their own sort of sets of numbers. And I would say from my own perspective, part of that has to do with once the word famine begins to, the possibility of it gets thrown out there, there's a lot of interest in that, and it sort of creates its own whirlwind for information. So that is one of the things I think puts a lot of pressure on folks. But so let me go to Peter now. I think Peter is going to tell us about some of the recommendations that came out of this study. Please note that these are not all the recommendations. This was a large study with many recommendations, so we can only discuss a few of them due to time constraints. So Peter, over to you.
Thanks, Greg. I'll just start with two conclusions, and they've been mentioned all the way through the presentation so far, but I think they're worth reminding you of two particularly important points. One is that an emergency, especially a conflict-related emergency, are political processes. Often in the heat of the crisis, people working in humanitarian aid don't often, they feel that they're more isolated from political influences, or they try to make themselves isolated from political influences. And analysts and others should be aware that you cannot isolate yourself. The challenge is, how can you manage these politics and minimize its influence? And the second thing is that for those of us looking in and trying to understand what is going on the analysis in these complex environments, we need to keep in mind that where you have the most complex political context, and where you have weaknesses in the technical capacity to analyze, and data quality and data availability, this is the place where you need to keep an eye very carefully on managing the political influences and minimizing them. Next, please. So to the recommendations. In all the countries that we did case studies on, they had twin objectives. One was to put the government in the lead of the analysis, quite rightly so, and to build their capacity to be able to lead that analysis and to take action based on what the results were saying. And secondly is to provide an independent and a rigorous analysis of the humanitarian conditions. When you reach these highly complex and very difficult and extreme conditions, we would recommend that we need to have a mechanism that would ensure that the independence of the analysis, the second of those objectives, takes precedence over the capacity building and government lead. And this is connected to the idea of the responsibility to protect in humanitarian emergencies. Secondly, promote honest reporting. That sounds a very easy thing to say, but it's a very difficult thing to do under the pressures that many of the technical people are operating under. There needs to be a very clear reporting of the challenges, the weaknesses and the gaps in the data and analysis. And many or most of the donors and decision makers, senior decision makers that we spoke to, said they would trust the analysis even more if they knew about these challenges and weaknesses and the gaps that are in the analysis. So transparency and potentially using a reliability score for the analysis in our interviews came out as being something that would improve the trust in the final results of the analysis and reduce the suspicions of political influence. Next, please. Treat humanitarian data as a public good. It was mentioned earlier that there are occasions that we've documented where data, the availability of data for independent inspection and analysis have become a very contentious issue and have reduced the trust in the analysis and increased the space for political influence on the analysis. then secondly, we need to, some of the lessons learned from some of the case studies was that a very transparent and close relationship with senior leadership, both in the UNHCT and with donors, is a good way to counteract the influences of the politics on the analysis, making sure that there's a regular briefing, that there's a regular and transparent explanation on what the challenges are being faced by the technicians, and looking at how the senior leadership can support the technicians to mitigate those political influences. Next, please. You heard Lindsay mention about this just right position of maybe putting a lot of population in need in phase 3 and phase 4 and none in phase 5. We have seen examples of that in the case studies, and we would recommend that the analytical process needs to develop a few tools and allocate time in their analysis to double check themselves about whether this is what's happening through the analytical process, and to take steps to mitigate if that's the case. We need to strengthen existing capacities. Of course, this is a constant issue, and there are lots and lots of trainings and processes to build technical capacities, but there needs to be more focus on let's call them the soft skills of the leadership of the analytical process. So skills of coordination, skills of leadership, also of being able to manage a highly difficult conversation where voices get raised and there's a lot of fighting goes on at times in the technical working groups. How do we manage that? How does the leader act as a peacekeeper within the analysis? Next, please. And finally, we need to broaden the meaningful participation in the data collection, analysis, and communication. It was mentioned earlier. These are quite intense processes, and outside of a small group of analysts, the participation from other organizations is voluntary, and it takes up a lot of time. But the IPC leadership, or I mean the analytical leadership, needs to make every effort possible to make it possible for as many people as possible, as many organizations to be represented, and for their voice to be heard. This is probably the one recommendation that would be most useful in helping to manage and mitigate the political influences, and to build the trust in the analysis once the analysis is presented. If people have been involved and have been able to express their thoughts or their analysis of the situation, then trust is much higher at the end. And finally, there are times where the consensus building and the consensus process breaks down. And there are examples in the case studies. A particular one is the Famine Review Committee of governance systems for resolution of these serious disagreements. There needs to be more attention to make sure that they are clear, and that participants in the analysis can use them to find a solution to these breakdowns in consensus. There are even times when those processes don't work, and we need to allow space for speaking outside of the consensus in a way that is not damaging to the relationship in the long term between organizations working on these types of analysis across countries and across time within countries, so that we can continue to work together to come out with a good analysis. I'm finished there. I'll hand back to Greg. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. Yeah, I think for most of you, the recommendations those are pretty clear. And one of the things that strikes me the most is this relationship between reliability and leadership, and the challenges that those of you that, particularly for those that are in the field and right up against it, how do you get the information out that you want in a way that those that have to process it and make decisions with it really understand it and can really rely on it. So yeah, interesting challenge there, and good recommendations. So let me say that this study was peer reviewed by 2 experts in food security analysis. And we're thrilled to have them to provide their thoughts on the study. First, we'll hear from Margie Buchanan Smith. Margie has over 30 years experience of working in the humanitarian aid sector as a policy researcher, practitioner, evaluator, and coach. And throughout that period, she has been working on food security issues and especially on early warning and humanitarian information systems. She recently led the interim final evaluations of the IPC global program. Margie is a visiting fellow at the Feinstein International Center and a senior research associate at ODI. Margie, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Greg. And thanks for this opportunity. It's been a fascinating study, and I'm delighted to have followed it as a peer reviewer and now having the chance to engage as a discussant. As you, Greg, said at the beginning, information is about power and power is about politics. Yet there's been a long tradition of approaching early warning and food security information systems as predominantly technical exercises. And I think this study is yet another call for us to be much more politically savvy in the way that we approach, design, and implement humanitarian information systems. And I think, indeed, it may be the first time that the politics of information analysis have been systematically researched in a number of highly politicized contexts. The study makes some important recommendations, and some I hope can be implemented more or less immediately. For example, the calls for greater sharing of data as a public good and for greater transparency of data analysis processes. Others are more challenging and may take longer to implement. For example, collecting some of that missing data. And I think that the study has really set out a challenge for all of us on that and a number of other areas. So I wanted to touch briefly on 2 areas. First, the consensus building process that underpins the IPC, and second, to say something about the importance of qualitative information. So as we concluded in the IPC evaluation that was published last year, the IPC has indeed become the international global standard for analysing acute food insecurity, on which many decisions are now based. But with that comes a huge degree of responsibility. And building consensus is the fundamental principle on which the IPC is based and indeed for which it's valued. Yet as this study and our evaluation highlighted, this itself can be a highly political process. And the danger is when it is portrayed and or understood as a purely technical exercise. So as with this study, our evaluation concluded that much more attention must be paid to who participates in the consensus building process, and this must be clearly stated in the interest of transparency. There needs to be greater investment in ensuring qualified, experienced, and neutral facilitation. And navigating the politics of the analysis process cannot be left to junior technical officers. It requires the engagement of senior leadership, recognizing that it's not an entirely technical process. So we really need to keep critically reviewing how these consensus processes happen, how consensus is reached, and keep learning from the good practice examples. Secondly, on qualitative information, the study briefly touches upon the limited capacity for the collection and analysis of qualitative information and how this in particular is highly vulnerable to political manipulation. Indeed, for at least the last decade, probably longer, there's been a strong trend towards quantitative data collection and analysis in the sector. But there is now a move to bring more qualitative and more anthropological data into our understanding of people's experience of humanitarian crises. It's extremely relevant in food security information systems for a more people-centric approach to understand how people and communities are responding, coping, and adapting. But qualitative data is also essential to understand conflict dynamics, including how relationships between different groups are affected and changing, something that cannot be measured, yet as this study indicates, must be given more attention as a cause of food security. So in our evaluation of the IPC GSP, the global programme, we recommended that high quality qualitative data is given equal weight to large-scale quantitative surveys in the IPC analysis. And I'd just like to finish with a plea that we really invest in improving our qualitative data collection and analysis processes, ensuring its robustness, developing criteria for judging that, so it is not so easily manipulated politically, and so that it cannot just be rubbish so easily methodologically or as anecdotal. So let me leave it there and hand over to Kamal.
Before you do, thank you, Marie. Let me introduce our next speaker, Kamal Wanjohi, who is currently Senior Technical Advisor on Food Security and Information Systems for FAO Yemen. Prior to that, he served as the Implementation and Country Support Team Leader for IPC Global Support Unit, Regional Coordinator for the IPC team in East and Central Africa, IPC Team Leader in South Sudan, and Senior Information Manager for FSNAU Somalia. Kamal is one of the most senior and respected food security analysts and information systems specialists. Kamal, over to you. Go ahead.
Thanks, Greg, and I'm very happy to be part of this webinar where most of my colleagues are participating and also as a peer reviewer for the studies. As noted by the presenters, it's unrealistic to think that the analysis we can operate completely independent of political interests, but our goal is to strive for an impartial evidence-based analysis by managing politics and minimizing its influence on the final results. So I would like to talk more about the last 3 years during which these studies were conducted and some of the lessons learned through these studies. From the perspective of the analysts, most of whom are participating today, it's easy to think that the challenges we face are unique to our context, but having such diverse study of different countries help to relate with others from different countries and to look at common solutions through cross-learning and shared experiences. Although a lot still needs to be done in managing politics and minimizing its influence on the analysis, major strides have been made and by these countries, and more still needs to be done. So for example, resource partners have become more involved through frequent interaction with technical analysts to find ways of addressing some of the challenges they face. Technical agencies like the IPC Global Support Unit have come up with guidance that protect technical analysts, but also ensure results are not blocked by governments. And agencies that working tirelessly in countries, especially in these countries that we're looking at, have adopted systems and practices that build upon lessons that they've learned in the past. So more specifically, a good example is South Sudan. Some of the challenges identified by the study for South Sudan revolved around issues of access and security, threats to independent and objective analysis, and data quality. By highlighting these issues, the study underscored the importance of a multi-stakeholder involvement in a much higher level, and this is what Maggie has just mentioned, beyond the technical teams who were involved in the day-to-day activities. So, informed by the blockage of the analysis, IPC analysis in August 2016, and highlighted in the study, one of the things that South Sudan did is there was a high-level UNCT joint lobbying, including NGOs, for quick turnaround in the results once they're released, in the release of the results once the analysis is complete. And now this has become a common practice in South Sudan. Another good example in South Sudan is on data sharing. Data sharing and quality checks has become a common practice in the recent analysis, and where the access constraints prevent collection of data, qualitative data has now started becoming one of the reliable information that is used in the analysis. So there is some good strides that are going towards this. Similarly, in Yemen, although Yemen is most recent and it's not to the same extent as South Sudan, there have been active steps that are being undertaken to manage challenges of politics and information, politics on information and analysis. The study of Yemen identified independence of data collection, transparency, and influence on the analysis as some of the major constraints. Just in the recent nationwide assessment for Yemen, the international community, with strong backing from donors, worked with authorities to ensure certain red lines, and they actually developed clear red lines, will not cross. And that then will ensure transparency and independence of the data collected. But as I mentioned in the beginning, major strides have been made towards reducing political influences, but a lot still needs to be done. Some of the solutions that are adopted by countries help to maneuver from one analysis to the next, but whenever unknown variables emerge, for example, right now, the COVID-19, for instance, or even a new conflict in an otherwise peaceful district, these solutions are reset to zero, and often new negotiations have to be initiated over and over. This is what is happening right now in Yemen, where negotiation for transparent data collection is considered one of the greatest achievements. But with the emergence of COVID-19, the independence of the analysis is not guaranteed due to lack of data sharing protocols. So any system, food security and information system, food security and nutrition information systems included, is only considered resilient if it is backed by policies and strong institutions. So in order to achieve our goal of minimizing political influences in analysis, donors, the international community, and governments should endeavor to create policies that withstand any of these unknown variables. I think with this, I would like to pass to you, Greg. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kamal, and thank you, Margie. You know, what's interesting is I had a conversation yesterday with a colleague who's working in Massachusetts on tracing during COVID, and her comment was, this is such a political process, I hope I never have to do politics again in my humanitarian work. So we can talk about it in terms of famines, but we can also talk about the political challenges of COVID here as well. So, all right, well, I want to thank all the presenters for engaging with us and for your presentations. We've got, we're going to go to the Q&A side of things. We have a number of them. And as both Kamal and Margie talked about qualitative data, so the first question actually goes to Gian. Gian, you noted that qualitative information is often not a part of these systems and implied that this is a problem in the context of politicized analysis. But isn't it a lot easier to politicize qualitative data since it isn't objective?
Thanks, Greg. This builds on the piece that Margie elaborated before on the importance of qualitative information, so I won't belabor her points there, that qualitative information can be really critical for capturing lived experiences of those community members who are living through famine or near famine emergencies, or unpacking the conflict dynamics. Before I dig into my response, one thing I want to distinguish is that qualitative and objective information refer to two different categories of data. Qualitative refers to data that's captured using words, phrases, basically non-numerically, whereas quantitative is referring to the numerical information that's captured. Often there's a misnomer that qualitative data are inherently subjective, but in fact, as our presentation have showcased, quantitative can both be qualitative, quantitative information can also be subjective and can be very fraught for political vulnerabilities. I think the point that is made that is important here and has been showcased through a case study is that because there's a lack of guidance on the way in qualitative information should be collected, validated, how it should be incorporated in the analytical process, it is currently very fraught and vulnerable for political manipulation. Information that is qualitative can be quickly tossed aside if it's not convenient for political reasons as hearsay, and brought in when it is considered politically strategic to do so. I think what we are advocating for and what our case studies have showcased is the need for greater guidance and technical capacity building to ensure that qualitative information are held to the same level of rigor, same level of validation process and data sharing that quantitative information currently is, to make sure that they're not so vulnerable to political manipulations in the future. So I'll pass it over to you, Greg, unless others have anything else to add.
Good. No, thank you, Gian. Thanks very much. Let me go to another question that's out there, and I'm going to read it. We agree to the findings that famine analysis are mostly political and linked to vested interests of donors, UN agencies, INGOs, and host governments. My question is regarding the study itself, funded by donors such as DFID or a subsidiary, how to manage to analyze the study where there is obvious interest in funding from DFID. So let me just turn to Peter on that one.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, it's going to always be a problem with all of these processes because people involved in the analysis, people involved in the data collection, and then even ourselves involved in the review of the situation are funded by donors. I think you can see from the recommendations and the findings that they're not very comfortable findings and recommendations in many places, and that they are also putting some responsibility back on the donors themselves to take more of a role in managing the political influences and to look at what their contribution to those political influences are in the process. I don't know if that answers the question. Over.
Thanks, Peter. Well, it's definitely a fraught one. I think for having been a donor, I think the challenge is that as a donor, you have to be able to accept the bad news, and that is not always it's not always easy. Anybody else want to add in on that question?
Maybe just briefly, Greg.
Go ahead, Dan.
Well, actually, the recommendation that Peter put out there about honest reporting, regardless of circumstances, actually came from a donor. The donor will remain anonymous, but that response came from a donor, not from perhaps some other user of the information that might have a similar interest. And I think the point of that is it's just impossible to make good decisions if you have doubts about whether or not the information has been politicized, or the extent to which conclusions are based on data that may not be very complete or very good in the first place. So Peter is correct. We all have to be very aware of our own biases and our own the way we interpret information, etc. But I think it's a bigger question than just donors. I think it's all of us.
Yeah.
You, Greg.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, that's. I think it's very true for donors. It's good that a donor put that out there, and you just have to be willing to accept the bad news, and you have to. But also, you want to have the right data so that as you go and appeal for more funding, you're trying to get the right amount so that you don't get slammed later on with questions about why were you perhaps off in what you asked for. So let me go to the second question. Data sharing is a very sensitive subject, especially in the context of protracted emergencies. Hang on a second, my screen just jumped on me here. Sorry. Let me get, sorry. In the context of protracted crisis, what is your practical suggestion as to how to improve that? Dan, maybe I can turn to you for that one.
Sure, thanks. Actually, Kamau already referred to a couple of things, but let me expand on that a little bit. Yes, data sharing is sensitive for all the reasons that that Gian raised. But one practical suggestion that grew out of the South Sudan. Well, actually, it was well after the South Sudan case study was over. But as we were monitoring what was happening in South Sudan, there had been quite a fight over access to data for independent analysis. And at the end of the day, a sort of a negotiated settlement was arranged whereby the data would be jointly cleaned by a number of different agencies. A log would be kept on everything that was done during the data cleaning. The data would be analyzed jointly, and the outputs would be shared accordingly. That's one practical suggestion. Some sort of a local agreement that addresses local needs for data sharing, but also protects against some of the concerns that Peter was mentioning. I mean, I guess the other practical suggestion on this is a little bit more heavy-handed, perhaps, but I think this is something donors can help with. That humanitarian information needs to be treated as a public good in real time, and that's one of the considerations, or one of the implications of accepting donor funds to do this kind of analysis. Do you want to add anything on that, Peter?
I think there are legitimate worries of analysts and so on at the start of the process of analyzing data, cleaning it, and so on, and how to manage those so that an organization or an individual technician reputation is not damaged, but that trust is maintained in the process of arriving at the analysis is the key question. And I think that the nutrition group have a solution. The solution you mentioned in South Sudan is there, and there may be other ways of doing it, but there are two sides to the story about sharing data, and they have to be carefully managed to ensure that people trust the system. Over.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Dan, for that. I've got a question for Lindsay. Lindsay, you said that these analyses often don't take into consideration the impact of conflict because it is too political. But can't conflict analysis be conducted outside the context using publicly available data?
Thank you, Greg. It's a good question. There is publicly available data for conflict. ACLED is an example. The Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. Analysts have looked at that data and overlaid it directly onto food security indicators, IPC outcomes, number of population need. But the relationship between that conflict data and the prediction of the food security crisis is inconsistent, and it's challenging. It gives details such as how many people were killed or where the events occurred, but it's not necessarily all the information needed about specifically how the community experiences the conflict. You can imagine examples such as the displacements of the population, disruptions in markets, or, for example, impact on planting cycles, etc. So I think that nuanced understanding of the conflict could be missed. It's not to say that other types of conflict analysis aren't happening in the countries, but I think often they don't make it into the food security analysis. There's statements such as conflict and man-made hazards contribute to food insecurity, and that may not be very helpful in getting into the understanding of how those communities experience it. Dan, maybe over to you. Do you have any examples from the case studies?
Actually, not so much from the case studies as from some separate work that we've been doing, and this is very preliminary work, so I hate to put these conclusions out there as by any means exhaustive or complete, but we've been looking at the relationship between access data and food security outcomes in Yemen and South Sudan and Somalia, and we're getting highly different results from that analysis. So for example, in South Sudan, there does seem to be a reasonable relationship with some kind of time lag between conflict events and negative food security outcomes, both spatially and temporally. In Somalia, there doesn't seem to be any relationship like that at all. In fact, in some cases, it's almost a negative relationship, even though no one would suggest that conflict improves food security. And in Yemen, although it's someone else's work, not ours, there appears to be a temporal relationship, but not a spatial one. So I think, you know, we're still working hard on making use of publicly available data sets like this to help in the analysis of food security crises. But so many of the details and nuances, et cetera, aren't captured simply by the number of events or the number of fatalities. So I think we have a long ways to go on this, but it's certainly a one possible fruitful area to keep exploring.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Lindsay. We have a lot of questions here. So let me put this one out there. I'd like to hear on recommendations how best to involve authorities in the data collection and analysis process in order to increase ownership without jeopardizing quality of data or increase vulnerability towards politicization of those same authorities. Peter, do you want to take that one?
Thanks. I'm getting the difficult ones. I think it's very much a case-by-case basis. And one of our recommendations was that we need to keep a very close eye and find ways to manage that as we get into the more extreme circumstances, as we get close to famine or very extreme circumstances in countries. And those decisions about how much to involve government authorities and in what way to involve government authorities are not possible for only the technicians who are doing the data collection and analysis to make. They need to be made jointly as a humanitarian system about where the lines will be drawn, depending on the particular circumstances in that country at that time. I think that those are questions that the analysts themselves are asking every single time. And what we're recommending is that there is a recognition that that is something that constantly needs to be reviewed and needs much more involvement of the senior leadership within a country. I think Kamal also would like to weigh in on that one. I'll hand over to
Kamal. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Peter, and thanks, Greg. I think this is a very important question, especially in the context of the countries where the studies were done. And you have government authorities who are very sensitive when it comes to collection of information about their citizens, and rightly so, and not just in these countries. It's all over the world. So one key thing that is important is to ensure that very clear red lines are drawn, and this is example that I was given earlier. Very clear red lines are drawn in terms of what is the level of involvement of the government and the authorities in collection of the information. Once this is set and once this is agreed, usually it's a very difficult process to agree on these red lines. But as from a humanitarian imperative and also with the support of our resource partners and other agencies, once these red lines are clearly thought through and discussed, then you can involve them. If it is very apparent that they will not adhere to these red lines, then it's okay to clearly put the paper out there and say, you did not adhere to these red lines. It's, we are going to take these steps. And this has been done and it's possible. Over.
Thank you. Interestingly, we have a question that is On the recommendations, and this could go to you, Kamau, or you, Margie, or even Dan, or Peter, or anybody, or Jerome. On the recommendations, can the panelists highlight any that they have used and or that have shown promise in getting around this situation, by which I mean the political situation? I think that's what the questioner is saying. So, I mean, Kamau or Margie, let me turn back to you. In your experience, what has worked well for you?
Kamau, I'll let you answer that because you've been probably closer to it recently than I have. So why don't you answer and I'll see if I've got anything to add.
Right, Maggie, thanks. So I think one of the key is, at least in the recommendations that have been presented here, is the one on strengthening capacities. We have often you see that due to very, very high turnover with either the international expatriates who go into some of these countries with the duration of the maximum time they can work there, or even institutions, local institutions and government institutions who then get trained and easily are snatched by the NGOs and the UN. The continuous strengthening of existing capacities, new capacities often is one that has worked for me, definitely. South Sudan, very good example where the capacities that have been built over and over and having, even whenever there's turnover, having the same capacities being passed on to the people who remain. This is very key. And this is one of the things that I would encourage all these countries that are being studied, and even the ones that will come in future. It is very important to continuously, relentlessly build capacities and not stop. I know with our resource partners, it becomes a point where you have been doing this, building capacity over and over, and we are probably not seeing the results, but it's because things change and we have to adapt. So building existing capacities and continuously building this is very key, and one of the ones I would pick out as a recommendation. Thank you.
Good, thanks, Kamau. Margie, do you want to jump in on that a little bit? I know that Peter also does.
Yeah, thanks. I just kind of wanted to come back again to the issue that's come up a number of times about who participates in the analysis, and I mean, what I'm aware of there is like good practice examples where maybe a more neutral player, like hoping they are more neutral, coordinator of the food security cluster in country has played that kind of neutral role about who participates in the analysis process. And I think that's been very important in enabling national staff and national NGO representatives to be part of the process, which I think is just another way of balancing the perspectives, the experiences, the knowledge that feeds into the analytical processes. But I think, again, it's everybody being alert to when these analytical processes almost kind of can spin on a coin and go from being very technical to being very political, and having that more kind of senior leadership capacity on standby to kind of come in and try and support the technical aspects of the process, but to come in at as early a stage as possible, when it does seem to be spinning into a kind of very, very sort of political domain. So yeah, those would be a couple of examples, but let me hand over to Peter on that.
Yeah, Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, connected to what Margie was saying, I think I see on the participants list quite a few people who've managed technical working group meetings for the IPC or the Cadre Harmonisé. And they all will be able to give you examples of days or hours within the technical working group where the temperatures rise, where voices rise, and where even people walk out, or there has to be a separate meeting for quite some time to find solutions. And I think that the recommendation on formulating a little bit how you manage those if solutions can't be found within the technical working group. We have some good examples of experiences on how you do that, where you allow at the end a mediated approach to having a minority report, or to referring the disagreement further up, as Margie said. And also being able to have a moment where if an organization feels that it can't be part of the consensus and can't be part of a minority report, that they are also allowed in a collegial way, as you do for any scientific process, to speak about outside of the consensus about their views. And for decision makers, they will need to read and try to understand and make a decision between the two views which are published. Too much emphasis put on having only one voice also damages trust, and you have a lot of murmuring and over a coffee or over a drink, someone saying yes, but we don't agree, and they wouldn't let us say that we didn't agree. And I think it's quite important that those sort of things are thought about beforehand, and that there are channels to manage those processes. Over.
Thanks, Peter. I've got so many questions here, but let me go to this one, which is from a colleague in West and Central Africa. Thank you all for this comprehensive presentation to address a very complex topic. Food insecure/vulnerable population estimation is often the most challenging part of the IPC Cadre Harmonisé analysis. Can we envisage to move from current consensus-based population estimates to a more systematic and data-driven approach? Can we introduce forecasting models to estimate food insecure in an IPC Cadre Harmonisé analysis? Can real-time data collection systems be a good alternative? So that's a lot to think about. Dan, I'm going to start with you, and then Gian, if you want to jump in on that, or anybody else, go ahead.
Thanks, Greg. I wish I could give a simple yes answer to all of those and be done with the questions. It's a little bit more complicated than that. First of all, let me clarify maybe one thing. We've been talking about consensus-based analysis, and there are good reasons for consensus-based analysis, but the question seemed to imply consensus-based data, like consensus-based estimates on population and so forth. Sometimes those do exist. Obviously, that's suboptimal compared to having reliable hard data on population. The reason that consensus estimates exist is because people have to rely on models and assumptions to more or less project what the current population is. Since in many of these countries it's been a long time since there was a census, there's population movement in and out of the country or within the country, etc. So the reason that we're stuck with using estimates and trying to find consensus between estimates is because there isn't up-to-date information. I'm glad that the person raised the question about forecasting and predictive modeling, because that is a rapidly growing field, and it actually does offer a number of ways in which some of these problems can be addressed. In fact, that was part of the reason why we were looking at the ACLED data and trying to incorporate that into sort of a predictive model. I mean, in many ways, these predictive modeling systems still have a long ways to go, but there is some very interesting work going on with regard to predicting food security outcomes. The work of Erin Lentz and some of her colleagues on that is quite interesting. There are people trying to predict mortality outcomes, particularly people like Francesco Cecchi at the London School, and trying to project nutrition outcomes, which is one of the things that, say, for example, the Merriam project is working on. And while all of these approaches to forecasting or predictive modeling are limited by the fact that they're the models are basically trained on past experience, and therefore maybe can't always incorporate data-driven approaches to understanding current events. They can be quickly modified to try and take these into consideration. The difficulty with them is that just like you can politicize data collection processes, you can also introduce political biases into the assumptions on which forecasting models are based. So I think where maybe we would come out on this is that it's great to use those predictive modeling approaches to places where you have a good basis for making projections and where you can't actually reach necessarily in real time yourself, but to always be thinking a little bit about what the assumptions are on which those models are based and whether those assumptions are being influenced in one way or another. And then, of course, the last part of the question was about real-time data collection, which is the only way we have to validate those models. So right now, I mean, with regard to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're seeing a lot of ramped up and very innovative approaches to sort of real-time data collection, some of which is highly qualitative in nature, to try and validate or fill in where those predictive models maybe are not working. So all of these things have the potential to help us solve both some of the technical problems and some of the political problems. I think one of the things we need to be careful about, though, is that to remember that just as politics can influence human-led data collection and analysis, political assumptions can also be embedded in some of these models. I don't know if others want to comment on that or not.
We can take one more comment. We've got a couple minutes left if anybody wants to jump in on that. Anybody? Okay. Well, we're about 2 minutes from the end of time. So I think what I'm going to do is we have a ton of other questions. If somebody I can give you one, and if we can answer it quickly, let's do this. Regarding red lines against government interference, have you or have any of the panelists experienced agreement with central government authorities, but continuing interference by local authorities? And how did you overcome this? So I wonder if maybe Kamal, you might want to, if you could address that quickly. We've got about 2 minutes left.
Yes. So the straight answer is yes, where the case of recent case of Yemen, which I gave as an example, the data collection can be said that it's relatively successful because red lines were set and mostly were respected. But this does not mean there were no cases where there was interference even during that, where the red lines are clear. I think in this case, the colleagues in Yemen, what they did is basically where it was blatant and very clear interference. In some of those areas, the enumerators were recalled and data collection stopped in those areas. This is very important because it shows the seriousness of red lines and the fact that by crossing red lines, it then gets to the transparency and the independence of data. So yes, this happens and it's possible.
Good, thank you, Kamal. All right, everybody, it's 10 o'clock. So I just want to thank you all for joining us and for sharing your questions and experiences. And thanks to our panelists, Dan Maxwell, Jian Kim, Lindsay Spanauer-Baker, Peter Haley, and also our discussants, Margie Buchanan-Smith, and Kamal Wanjohi. And to thank our donors once again for their support. If there are questions that we did not get to, please send them over to Dan Maxwell, who will get back to you or refer you to the right member of the study team. And you can see Dan's email on the screen, or can we pop that email up on the screen, everybody? I hope so, it's up by. And as a follow-up, we will share the webinar recording and a link to the reports with you next week. And when you leave the webinar, a one-question survey will pop up, and please do us a favor and take less than a minute to fill it out. And this concludes the webinar for today. So all I can say to everybody is thank you very, very much. We had great participation, more questions than we could possibly get to. And we wish you all a healthy day. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.